Hi there everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, bringing you another book to determine, is it worth reading of a second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? So let's decide. Today's book is a special little spooky thing for me, because it is, surprisingly, a Star Wars novel. Of course, all those who've seen my TBR is not that surprising. But it's also the first EU book I ever personally owned. Although it wasn't the first I read, it was probably closer to 5th or 6th in that category. And it's actually probably one of the first horror books I ever read. I was young when I got this, like 11, 12. And that book is Star Wars Death Troopers. Star Wars Death Troopers is a Star Wars Expanded Universe novel that was written by Joe Schreiber and released and published on October 13, 2009. It was a standalone work when it was first released. It was a standalone work when it was published, but about a year later it received a prequel by the name of Red Harvest, written by the same author. And it has the distinction of being the first Star Wars horror novels released since John Whitman's Galaxy of Fear series about 10 years prior. It had decent ratings as far as I can tell, and actually was apparently recently refeatured within the Star Wars Galaxies MMORPG game, which kind of recanonized it. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's what I read. I don't know if Star Wars Galaxy is considered canon. Now, before I dive deep into the story, we start where we always start. The cover. Now, I actually like the cover. I mean, it's simple, but it does its job well. You have basically a dark metal background, which is the Durasteel, that most of Star Wars ships or space objects are made out of. I think even just buildings, to be completely honest with you. While in the main foreground, pulling your direct focus, is a bloody stormtrooper helmet hanging from a hook that, admittedly, the perspective is a tiny bit off because the way the hook is designed with the helmet, it kind of just looks like the hook is like right here as opposed to actually digging in. That's a minor complaint and you kind of have to look at it. But you see the stormtrooper helmet is covered in blood with this little breather thing ripped out, and if you look closely you can see the giblets of a severed head underneath the helmet, showing that this helmet is not empty. And it's very good at kind of forewarning you about the gore that's actually going to be in there. Now on the back, you have, since this is a paperback, just the synopsis along with two small quotes from other horror authors, specifically zombie authors, the guy who wrote Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, and Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Slayer. And Tommy Wirkola, the director of Dead Snow. I mean, he didn't really write a book, but that's not my point. But otherwise it does its job well. I actually kind of like the cover because it's simple, but also gives you a clear idea what this story is going to be about. You can see a lot of wear and tear. Like I said, I've had this book for over a decade and a half now. So yeah, it's definitely an older book. Like I said, you can kind of tell because it doesn't have the legends on the side, which I don't know the exact year it became Legends, but it's been a bit now. Now, as for the story itself, I read the synopsis on my TBR, which I do highly recommend you check out. It'll be giving you a good idea what I'll be doing this month. I've read the synopsis of my main TBR, and while I haven't quite gone into what I'll be reading on the side, that's for good reason, because I'm doing the A to Z horror challenge. This book is, but to go into that, this book is when the Imperial prison barge, the Purge, or just Purge, is floating through the galaxy when its engines basically undergo a major malfunction. However, they seem to get lucky as they realize that there's a derelict star destroyer nearby that they can go on and salvage for parts. However, upon sending a salvage crew aboard, only half make it back, as the other half just completely disappeared. And that happens within this virulent sickness that spreads through the Purge within hours, and by the end of the day, almost everyone is dead. except for the people who are immune to the airborne strain. And then that's when the dead start to walk. Now the book follows seven survivors of the Purge as they struggle to try to escape the undead menace that is now haunting the halls. Compared to my previous month's books, I actually have quite a few good things to say about this book. And I'm really glad, because I don't think I could do another month where every book deserved Mount Doom. So, and honestly, I'm even glad for another reason, because this is a childhood classic of mine. And it's one of those, I was really worried it wouldn't hold up the way it did. And I'm very glad. I may actually appreciate this more now than I did as a kid. Fun fact, I actually loaned it to my friend when we were in high school together. If you don't know them, their name is Rikari. There's a link to her channel down below. And apparently it was so scary for her, it gave her nightmares. So, she's gonna hate that I put this in here, but I put it in here. But anyways, the first compliment I have is, and it kind of goes back into what I just said, despite being set in the Star Wars setting, something most people would normally associate with family-friendly, especially now that Disney has it, this book does not skimp on the horror or zombie-ness. Honestly, this is a zombie book first and a Star Wars book second. So a good way of putting it is it's not a Star Wars book with zombies. It is a zombie book that takes place in the Star Wars universe. And I really enjoy that. Schreiber went all in when it comes to the horror, at least for Star Wars. I mean, like I said, I'm not a huge horror buff myself, so this is actually pretty close to all in for the horror for me. Yeah, he does not skimp. You have gore, you have very tense moments, you got an uneasy atmosphere, and you know what? Just because you think characters might be safe in this, they are not. Schreiber is not shy about killing off certain characters. So yeah, I'm not going to tell you which ones, because obviously that'd be a huge spoiler, and I want you to go read this book if you can. So a good example to how no one is safe on this is that the first death in this book, and it's not shown, but it is very heavily implied. The first death of this book is a Wookiee child who is eaten alive by his zombified parents. And yeah, that's how this horror section starts. And that should tell you everything you need to know about how this book goes. Another great thing about this book, though, is that it has great characters to go on top of that. And that works really well with horror. One of the tricky things with horror is that I've noticed, at least anyways, is that you have to balance good characters with the bad characters, because one of the big tropes in horror, one of the big tropes in horror is the jackass character who everyone wants to die but always seems to survive to near the end, to where he dies as one of the last characters. And that's typically because people want him to die. It's not sad to see him die. You don't really get the horror. You want him to fall on the knife. You want him to get chopped up because of the way he acts. But you feel sad when when the good people die. It was one of the things that the Halloween reboot was highly praised for, in that it made actually interesting, likable characters that it killed. And while I have my own issues with that Halloween reboot, I do agree that when it comes to horror, you need to have likable characters in order for the horror to work as effectively as it does. Because if you hate everyone in the story, you're not really going to feel that sense of suspense when people start dying. And like I said, these characters are pretty good. There's only one unlikable character. There's only one unlikable sort of jackass character in here, and even then, I think he's done really well in comparison to most others, because while he is I will let everyone else die to save myself at first, you see very early on that he struggles a lot with himself and that morality he's picked up. And while it is a little clunky in my opinion, it does humanize him enough that you don't necessarily just want to see him dead. But you also have Trig and Kale Londo, who are sort of main characters. Trig is, anyways. And they're both very good characters. You have Dr. Zahara Cody, the Imperial prison barge doctor, who treats her patients like they're actually people, despite the fact that Imperials treat them more like animals. And then you have the two legacy characters, which I won't spoil who they are. The book treats it like a big reveal, although admittedly it's probably going to be easy to guess based on how I have to dance around it. But there are two legacy characters in here. What I really do like what this book did with at least one of them, because it dives into a part of their backstory that really doesn't see much focus in these EU novels, or really in general. You don't really see much. I mean, in fairness, they're always kind of a sort of background character in a lot of the stories, but it actually gives them a pretty decent focus, and it delves into a part of the story that admittedly was canonized in something awful, but that's not the point here. But it's really good. And like I said, the characters are just top notch, and it really helps sell the horror. That being said, I do have some mild complaints here and there, and it actually does involve the legacy characters themselves. And that's mostly because, unfortunately with like a lot of EU novels that aren't directly dealing with the legacy characters, the legacy characters always kind of feel a bit wrenched into the story. And while these ones are kind of wrenched in, the main complaint I actually had with them was, by their introduction, you already lose some of the tension behind what's going on. Because in the timeline of the EU, this takes place before A New Hope. And the legacy characters obviously have to show up in the following movies without any worse for wear. So, Joe Schreiber sort of had to write around the fact that these legacy characters were there. There's no tension because you know they're not going to die. You know they're not going to get maimed. You know they're not going to really suffer that badly during this, because the legacy characters, they have to show up later, and it still has to make sense that this existed as part of the canon. And while I do think Schreiber does his best with the legacy characters, honestly, with the EU, I'm not sure if they're mandated to have to put in at least one legacy character of some kind, or if just... But Joe Schreiber does do his best. I just acknowledge that with those legacy characters introduced, some of the horror does go away because you know they're not going to get hurt in any significant way. Another small complaint I have is there's a few cop-outs here and there, and it actually not involving the legacy characters. The legacy characters never really get a cop-out. But I brought it up a lot in my Grey Griffins review, how, you know, when you get works aimed at younger audiences, there's a lot more coincidence or those moments where a character's in trouble, but you can't have them in too much trouble, so something will come up. Like in Grey Griffins, they're being cornered by the Slayer Goblin when a truck comes out of nowhere and hits the Slayer Goblin. That's the kind of thing I mean when I say cop-out. Now, in this case, I can't really go into any of the main cop-outs here in this book, because it happens more towards the end than it does in the middle or at the beginning. But one of the cop-outs, there's a fair amount of cop-outs that it seems like this one character's doomed, or it seems like this one character's going to suffer a lot, only for the last minute something to come up and save them. And while there's one or two that were well built up, so they're not really cop-outs to put out there, there's a couple there that was clearly, yeah, that was kind of a cop-out. That didn't make sense, really, with what you had going. So, unfortunately, it does have that. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. So, my final score is an 8 out of 10. Yeah, like I said, this book is really great. I really liked it much more than I found things wrong with it. You know what? Even the things that I did find wrong with it, I admit feel more like mild nitpicks or stretches rather than actually big complaints that ruin the story for me. I really do like how this was written. Like I said, this feels like a horror novel that happens to be set in Star Wars universe and not a Star Wars universe horror novel, if that makes sense to people. I personally would recommend this book to anyone looking to get into Star Wars, looking for a nice horror novel to read, anyone who loves zombie fiction. Yeah, if you like any of that, I recommend picking this book up and reading it. Obviously, it doesn't go into Mountain Doom. Now we've dealt into space that deals with undeath and horror, I thought to myself, well, I don't want to constantly just deal with undeath. I'd rather deal with just some dead space. Just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure's worth having, even the horrifying ones. Bye!